Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 7th of May. Today we have to cover 5 days worth of events. We're going to try to keep every single section of the video pretty brief due to the volume of information that I have to dissect. We're going to cover every single part of the front that is of particular relevance besides Chasiv because there aren't any new developments that I didn't discuss in my last video. And so we're going to start off with Robotyne, then Urozhaine, go to Novomykhailivka, Krasnohorivka, Avdiivka, and then at the end we'll go to Kyslivka and Kotlyarivka. But again, let's begin by looking at some of the latest information per reporting from both sides and geolocations around Robotyne, where we were aware already by the end of April of the Russian advance that occurred particularly in the western side of the village, with a lot of that advance occurring within the residential areas. You have the 70th Motorized Rifle Regiment and specifically their 2nd Battalion conducting a lot of the infantry advances, and you had Ukrainian troops from the 65th Mechanized Brigade withdrawing to the perimeter where they're still hiding out in various trenches and dugouts. And so the fighting is not over. The Russian forces have not taken over, I guess you could say, like a third of the village, and so now they're in the process of clearing it out, especially the eastern side. And so what we saw unfolding while I was on my hiatus, specifically around the 3rd of May and then going forward, is you had these smaller scale Russian infantry assaults with, in this particular case, 2 Russian infantrymen that advanced along this one southern road. I'll mark with an arrow to show you guys the vector of their advance. They were advancing along this road, and something that we're seeing a lot from the Robotyne front, and we're also seeing it around the Nevelske front, the Russian forces are employing on the line of contact a lot of these motorcycles for increased troop mobility, just to get a troop from point A to point B in an area where they need to overrun a certain Ukrainian position very quickly. So instead of relying on larger, bulkier vehicles that may be more valuable, they are just sending in a lot of infantrymen on these motorcycles. In this one case, the motorcycle, it was either hit directly or just hit nearby by Ukrainian shelling, and so the 2 infantrymen got off, and then they entered one of these nearby strongholds and they began clearing out positions, trying to ensure that there were no Ukrainians in the area, and that's how they were able to gain control over various residential areas within eastern Robotyne. And then over the next 2 days, going into May 5th, Russian forces in this region just continued clearing out this section of the village, and then by the 5th, we had another video of motorcycles advancing. It was actually just one, which carried 2 Russian troops. Sometimes one sitting behind the other, or sometimes you have a sidecar for the motorcycle. And in this case, you had those 2 infantrymen. They were able to advance further northwards. I think the extent, if we measure it, it's to 500 meters north. And then at that point, the Russian soldiers, they reached the basement, they threw grenades inside, and they were in the process of clearing it out. And so that's just a microcosm of what the Russians are doing in this area, trying to clear out whatever Ukrainian remnants remain. But even after that's done, there will still be some Ukrainian groupings that are still holding the perimeter around the village, and so the Russians will have to deal with pushing them out. But at the same time, once that's done, it presents a major threat for whatever Ukrainian infantry squad members are still present in this salient that is forming and is becoming increasingly more dangerous for whatever soldiers are here. And it's very similar to what we're seeing around Novomykhailivka, which I'll get to later in the video. But you could see how now the Russian forces are getting control of a lot of the hills on which Robotyne are located. The areas of Robotyne that are still in the gray zone or are under Ukrainian control are, for the most part, in the valley, while the Russians control most of the hills. And then all of Verbov is just located on a ridge. And so the Ukrainian positions in this blue rectangle are in a very precarious position, and it will only get worse once the Russians fully clear the village of Robotyne. Another area of the front that is recently heated up is the area around Urozhaine. If you recall, this is one of the attack vectors for the Ukrainians during their summer counteroffensive. And really the climax of their attacks occurred around Urozhaine, where the Ukrainian Marine Brigade succeeded in taking it over. Since then, they have reduced their presence, the Ukrainians, in this village and in nearby positions around the Novomykhailivka River, replacing them with territorial defense forces. And recently, I believe half a year ago or even more by now, they replaced them with the 58th Motorized Brigade. And so that's the unit that's doing the Ukrainian defending at the moment. And so starting at the end of April, of course, as I said before, the Russian forces beginning to put pressure along this paved road. and getting a foothold within the southern parts of the village. And so now we have additional videos past May 2nd confirming the Russian advance, which, as you can see over here, based on the polygon, it's an advance of about nearly 4 square kilometers. And what you'll see here is that the Ukrainians that are still in this defensive node are actively pushing back. So they did conduct a counterattack with one of their tanks. This is a video from the 58th Brigade, and their tank hit a Russian tank directly, and then that caused the 2 Russian BMPs that were part of that column that likely were trying to dismount infantry in this warehouse to withdraw further south. And so definitely the Ukrainian tanks and whatever forces that in the region, including some artillery components, are involved in trying to stabilize the line. And then further east, you have this video from the Wild Hornets FPV group, and it shows their FPVs hitting 3 Russian tanks that were advancing along this tree line. And the reason why they would even be trying to advance here is because you can see that for the most part, the eastern flank of Urozhaine is under Russian control in this section over here. The Russian forces would like to extend control to all of the fields east of Urozhaine. There are various dugouts here where Ukrainians are still holding out, and they're all located on hills. And you can understand on a local level how significant that is, because Urozhaine and also Novomykhailivka are both villages that are basically right next to the river valley. They're right on the river valley, right next to the Mokriali River. They're extremely low elevation compared to the surrounding regions where you do have ridges. And so, just on a local level, it just gives you a very good line of sight to get focus and basically get vantage points and firing points onto the supply lines and onto the positions within the village. And that's something that the Russians would like to take advantage of. Of course, you do still have the Ukrainian defensive components that are leading to damage to Russian vehicles, but you could see the general trend is the Russian forces are solidifying control over the southern warehouses, and the fierce battles are still going on. Further westwards, the Deep State on the 5th of May, they adjusted their mapping to show that there is a larger gray zone between the Russian line and the Ukrainian line. So the Ukrainians are trying to consolidate their defenses and prevent a Russian advance onto Novomykhailivka at the same time. Novomykhailivka is a bit more complicated because you do have a ridge overlooking it, which I guess I can mark over here. It's basically in between Prutny and Novomykhailivka, this ridge. And then the ridge just goes further north because the ridge basically runs parallel to the river valley. And so the portions of the river valley further north, those areas just to the west of them where I have this red X, those are also located on ridges. And so the Ukrainians, at least to a certain extent, have some fire support from those regions. But nonetheless, for the troops that are actually defending Novomykhailivka, it is a very difficult task. Looking at Novomykhailivka, we discussed on May 1st the video released by the 79th Air Assault Brigade detailing their attempt to repel the first Russian speculative armored assault along the road that starts in the Dachas and then goes west into Krasnohorivka. And so that was actually a success for the Ukrainian defenders. They destroyed it using shelling and dropping grenades onto the abandoned vehicles, and then the dismounted Russian soldiers were present in various trenches located to the east of Krasnohorivka, and they were targeted by Ukrainian grenades. And so that was just the first effort to try to gauge the Ukrainian defenses. In the days since then, we've gotten a lot of information from Russian sources implying that they've been able to occupy positions in the eastern houses of this hamlet. We do not know that for sure yet based on video confirmation or Ukrainian sources. And so for now, I'm not changing the map to reflect that. But what I will change is the area southwest of Novomykhailivka, because here we do have a video which shows one Russian armored vehicle making its way from Novomykhailivka westwards, then dismounting its forces, an infantry squad, within a trench. And so now this trench where you did have Ukrainian trenches that they built up, try to hold the line, now those have been taken over by the Russians. And this was done under Ukrainian artillery fire, which was not sufficient in repelling them, but it did destroy 2 vehicles earlier in the fighting. In any case, it does give us an idea of the Russians also trying to bolster their positions on the southern flank of this front. And when I say this front, I'm referring to the chain of towns located to the west of Novomykhailivka. As I've discussed ad nauseum, and I won't get into it much now, all of this area in between these 2 parallel lines is located on a ridge. And then you have all the villages on which the Ukrainians are currently defending, Krasnohorivka, Kotlyarivka, all these various clusters of defensive nodes, all of them located on valleys nearby ponds, and then you have various gullies and ravines in the area, and so the Russian forces would like to solidify control of the fields and trenches that are overlooking those major Ukrainian logistical hubs. Looking at Krasnohorivka over the past few days, Ukrainian sources like Deep State have become more candid about the fact that the Russian forces do have a large foothold in this town. But still, I do disagree with their mapping. I do think that it is too generous to the Ukrainian side based on the available geolocated data that we have. And so this was just further compounded by a video released on the 5th of May, which shows the Russian forces pretty comfortably hoisting a flag in the northern section of the refractory plant. Like, you can't see any of the soldiers that are standing in this open area on a roof being targeted by Ukrainian drones or artillery. And of course, it is just a snippet of a clip, and so it's not enough to make a general rule, but it should give you an idea of the fact that the Russians are now in control of at least that portion of the refractory plant, and it means it's only a matter of time before their forces in the region, which are mainly consisted of the 5th Oplot Brigade DPR units marked over here, and they're now likely in the process of just clearing out the remnants of the Ukrainian defenders in this industrial zone. And that means that the main Ukrainian defensive force, which consists of the 80th Air Assault Brigade and a few other air assault units in this region, they are trying to hold the line along the main road that bisects Krasnohorivka. I'll mark it in green, I guess, for you guys over here, and you can see that. And in terms of the defensive nodes that the Ukrainians have at to their advantage even now, they do have this apartment complex, which is currently giving them a line of sight towards the Russian forces, who for the most part do have control of the ridge. Basically, all these areas that you see me going over with my cursor, they are located on hills that are overlooking the Ukrainian positions in northern Krasnohorivka. And so the Ukrainians really do need to maintain control of whatever higher elevated points they have in the region, including these apartment buildings and further north around this hospital area. And keep an eye out for the eastern flank of Krasnohorivka. Not much has occurred over there in recent days, but I would keep an eye out for Russian pressure to continue in that region and for additional trenches to be cleared out. Looking at the front line south of Prvomaiske, this is a very important section that has been, I guess, looked over by many people covering the Avdiivka front. And I'd say it is critical. I've explained why in the last video, but I'll just say it again. This Ukrainian salient is holding out and preventing the Russian forces from stabilizing the line and then gaining control of a rather large hilly area, a rather large ridge that is overlooking much of the Ukrainian positions and supply lines leading into Krasnohorivka. You could see them across the Vavcha River on this red line over here, these red line segments entering Krasnohorivka. And so basically, the end of the salient that is south of Prvomaiske over here would, in essence, be the first step in leading to the end of Krasnohorivka, and by extension, any sort of Ukrainian positions in any of these fields that is located to the that are located to the east of the Vavcha River. And so that would be, at the end of it, at most a withdrawal of 14 kilometers, but if we're being fair, then you could say 10 kilometers westwards as a general trend. And then you'd have the next Ukrainian line of defense, which is rather strong just by nature, by the fact that there's so many villages clustered together, and the fact they have a ridge on the west side of the Vavcha River, and the fact they have all these trenches that are still in the process of being built, but at least they're standing, and at least they could be connected. That means that the Ukrainians will have a solid defense line, but it is something the Ukrainians definitely want to avoid, because then the Russians would be within striking distance of the local command center for the Ukrainians in South Donetsk. Kurakove, also supposed to be a forward artillery hub, and as the Russians get closer and closer, their counter battery fire is going to target those Ukrainian systems. Same thing about Selidove. At that point, you'd have Russian artillery on these hilly fields east of Vavcha River targeting the Ukrainian logistics and artillery around Selidove at a much heightened rate. And so definitely the Ukrainians want to prevent that. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of this ambiguity unfolding around this, I guess you could call it, Nevelske Salient. And so over the past few days, the Russian forces have made an effort to get control of some of the fields and tree lines located on the eastern outskirts of the salient. And so you could see, even per Deep State, there was an advance of the Russian forces south of the E50 highway a couple hundred meters. The process of clearing it out, though, is difficult because the Ukrainians are not in any hurry to withdraw. They are still resisting. And because there is just a high possibility that a lot of these trenches and dugouts are mined. And so the Russians are also taking their time with clearing it out one by one. And within all this context, the Ukrainians actually launched either they launched a counterattack or they were always in control of Nevelske. And let me explain that. So we have a video, I think it's from the 4th or 5th of May, and it's from the 110th Brigade, which is a unit within the DPR. And you have DPR units that are fighting around this front line, especially southwest of Pervomyske going to Netelove. The majority of it is actually from the 1st Army Corps units, and then you have a few other elements that I have marked on my map, like the 24th Special Purpose Brigade. They're also operating around here. And so the general point I'm trying to make is that we have a video from the DPR units showing how their FPVs struck a singular Ukrainian infantryman within the village itself. And this is in an area we thought was under solid Russian control. And I said this based on information that was coming out from Russian sources and from this geolocated video, which showed Russian soldiers from the 110th Brigade raising the flag in Nevelske. But in all fairness, those videos were all from the southern tip of the hamlet, and there was no confirmation of Russian capture of these warehouses further north. And so it's totally possible that at some point over the past few weeks or months, the Ukrainians were successful in pushing them back and are now still holding on to this hamlet in efforts to prevent the entire salient from falling. And that's likely the point, that's likely the case right now based on the geolocated footage and based on reporting from Deep State claiming that the Ukrainians were able to recapture some positions in fields and tree lines located just to the east of Nevelske. And so the Ukrainians are extending the process for their withdrawal, which will eventually happen, but they're trying to just give more time for the defenders on the rear to build additional fortifications. And at the same time, that's coming at the cost of whatever infantrymen they have at the line of contact, especially for the 59th Motorized Brigade. So just as an example, the 24th Brigade, the Russian unit, special purpose units, they were able to raid a Ukrainian outpost in the Pervomyske region. We don't have specifics about where it was located, but they did then post aftermath with some pretty gruesome footage showing how they were able to catch the Ukrainian defenders by surprise and eliminate an infantry squad within their tent in that region. Looking a bit further north than Netelove, there isn't much to mention, but Deep State did admit on 2 separate occasions that there was a Russian advance, which you could say amounts to 500 meters westwards. So you do still have Ukrainian resistance, which is mainly centered around the main road that is bisecting the village vertically. And so you have a lot of Ukrainian soldiers still in the western portion of this village. I would assume most of them from the 56th Motorized Brigade and then also some from the 53rd. And you could already see the issue that's being formed in terms of choke points because eventually the Russian forces will end up pushing through the last kilometer of the village. And at that point, the withdrawing forces and their equipment will be under fire from the crossings that go westwards, try to get over the Vovcha River, both along the E50 highway and then also further north in this crossing that is between the Kotlyarivka reservoir. And you can see that marked over here. And it's just located to the west of Krasnohorivka. And that area is also, first of all, located on very low elevation, but second of all, it's very narrow and is a checkpoint for any sort of moving forces, especially at this distance that is so close to the line of contact. A bit further north, we're seeing the consequences of the Ukrainian withdrawal, or they're pushing back from the Durna River line. And it's going on in a staggered process. We're not seeing the complete withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from these fields in a singular second, but we're seeing over several days that gradually fields are being abandoned, tree lines are being abandoned as the Ukrainians begin to coalesce around lines that are 5, 6, 7 kilometers westwards. And so, just as an example, we now have the Russian forces actually crossing over the Durna River, and I'll show you guys the location where that occurred. Here's the Durna River for you guys, and then they cross it over in this portion over here, which if we measure the extent of the gain, it's about 800 meters at most northwards. And in the process, per Deep State's own mapping, the Russian forces were able to occupy some of the trenches located to the east of Umanske. And this was supposed to be a very strong Ukrainian defensive node that was supposed to last for an extended period of time and provide protection for the southern flank of the Durna River line. But now, due to this withdrawal that is occurring towards the Umanske Novomykhailivka area, the Ukrainians are giving up some of these trenches in a staggered process. and the Russian forces are taking them over. And that is also going to put a lot of pressure directly on the garrison in Nevelske from the main road leading into the village from the east around here. We also have additional information pertaining to Russian advances in the field south of Solovyove. We could see how, if we're measuring it, at most the Russians advance 2 kilometers. Then you have this little spearhead that's directed towards Novomykhailivka, which is 2.75 kilometers away from the original line of contact from my earlier videos. And this is just due to the Ukrainians not being able to field any sort of defense in this region. Any sort of Ukrainian resistance in these open fields would be met by intense Russian artillery bombardments and just by their columns and infantry advancing at a pace that the Ukrainians cannot deal with. And so now you have a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements that are regrouping, and it's happening. We don't know actually the manner in which it's happening, whether it's orderly or disorderly, but you could imagine just having so many units packed into one area. And that's not to say that there are a lot of men in this area, but there are a lot of different people from different units. And all of them have their own task, a lot of them have their own drone groups, and then coordination between those various units becomes very difficult. And when you have a smaller and smaller amount of infantry, and they're not coordinating together in a proper way within a small area, then it does create issues in the long term. And so now you have the Russian forces beginning to probe the eastern section of Novomykhailivka, and they're doing that directly from the east, but also you can see how a vector to flank Novomykhailivka from the north is already being formed due to the Russian advances along this road to the west of Solovyove. And just to remind you guys, all of these villages that the Ukrainians are now withdrawing to are located on valleys that are overlooked by the fields that are currently in a gray zone or are being occupied by Russia. And so that is an issue as the Russians begin to take full control of those areas and begin to utilize them for reconnaissance and for firing missions. And the Ukrainians, of course, they are not passive. They are releasing on a daily basis videos of FPV drones targeting Russian soldiers in Solovyove. Solovyove is basically turned into this forward hub for Russian infantry squads. Not as much for vehicles yet, although we did have the videos we talked about in earlier uploads on this channel. But yeah, you do have some Ukrainian drone strikes on Solovyove and the houses over there. And you can generally see how the Russians advanced along this area over here in that blue rectangle. Then going further north, here we have some very important developments around Arkhanhelske. And we basically have confirmation of what I was talking about in my last video, the fact that the Ukrainians are in the process of withdrawing from the village, and they're withdrawing from the western sections because the Russian spearhead to take over the village occurred from Karamik and Novomykhailivka. It occurred in this attack vector going to the northwest, and they were able to establish around 60% control of Arkhanhelske by the 4th of May. And at that point, the remaining Ukrainian holdouts were located in the western sections of the village and also around the various trenches that they'd built up just to the northwest of Arkhanhelske. And so the Ukrainians, they tried holding on for as long as possible, but eventually became untenable. The Russian forces were advancing. We got verification of this on the 5th and 6th of May. Here we have the verification based on videos from the Ukrainian side showing them dropping grenades on Russian infantry that dismounted in a tree line located east of Arkhanhelske. And then here we have the video showing the Russian flag being hoisted in the northern part of the village. And the most interesting video of all shows the aftermath of the Ukrainian defeats, where you do have a platoon worth of men. And this is a very insane video. It's a platoon worth of Ukrainian men, 25, maybe even more that I can't see in the frame, but 25 Ukrainian men that were withdrawing in a singular row, basically, or singular column, advancing northwards, abandoning their positions within the village and located just to the west of it, because you do have this massive fortification system, this strong point that they held out for several days. There were just back and forth battles, but eventually it became untenable. There was no way to support the platoon over there, and so they had to make the choice to withdraw. And they did this without any sort of cover, without any sort of external support. Did it in broad daylight as well, and so the Russian forces, of course, spotted it, and they began launching artillery barrages towards the Ukrainian troops that were withdrawing, and they were withdrawing probably around this road, trying to reach some of the other trenches to the north. And we don't know what exactly happened to that platoon because the video cut out before we got the full fate of those soldiers, but it should just give you an idea of what has been occurring to the Ukrainian frontline soldiers that are located in this region. And now those same soldiers that are totally fatigued have to withdraw even more, have to be fired upon by the Russians. they were again trying to reorganize around Kalinove, and I could already see where this is going, and I talked about this in several videos already. The capture of Arkhanhelske will first of all unite the Russian attack nodes around Karamik and Ocheretine, which means the front line is going to become more stable for the Russians. They're going to be able to move more equipment, artillery, closer to the line of contact without having to deal with some sort of Ukrainian response. And now what this means is that they're going to be able to advance more freely along this western flank and along this eastern flank through fields that are located on hills that overlook Arkhanhelske, first of all. But now they have control of that village, but they of course overlook the various trenches the Ukrainians built in the region, and they overlook Kalinove. And so Kalinove is already in the process of being fired upon by the Russian forces, and as time goes on, it will become more and more exposed. And by virtue of Kalinove becoming more exposed, so too will all of these trenches located east of Kalinove. This would be a goal, if I were from the Russian perspective looking at it, this would be a very important target. All of these trenches, all these strong points located on the H20 highway, because they are located on ridges, they are located on hills, and they are currently getting closer and closer to the line of contact, especially from the west where Kalinove is in danger. And by taking them over, the Russian forces would have control of the predominant heights in the region, and they would be undermining the western flank of New York over here. Now, moving on to the Kupiansk front, we do have information indicating the capture of the entirety of Kyslivka. But before we get to that, just looking at the timeline, the Russian forces, they were able to infiltrate via the hills located on the rail line to the north of Kyslivka. That's how they were able to initially enter the eastern parts of that village. And so there was some back and forth fighting in the end of April. And then, starting around May 2nd, you had the Russian forces advancing along the hills to the east of Kotlyarivka, crossed over the rail line, and gained control over much of that village. And then we got full confirmation of the capture of Kotlyarivka a couple of days ago, based on a video from the 43rd Mechanized Brigade, a Ukrainian unit defending in this region, where I think they conducted 7 FPV strikes on Russian positions in various houses in Kotlyarivka. We didn't really see any Russian soldiers in those 7 videos, but they were targeting the ruins of houses. And then also 2 strikes on Russian vehicles. And one of the strikes on the houses basically confirms to us that the Russian forces are located in western Kotlyarivka. And you also had adjustments to Deep State's map to indicate the same thing. And then around Kyslivka, interestingly, on May 5th, the Deep State map updated their indications of the control in the region, showing that the Russian forces had full control over Kyslivka, which is interesting because previously the line of contact looked something like this, and we don't have any geo locations yet to verify this advance. So I'll keep an eye out for that, but it is likely the case if Deep State is reporting it. And now here we have just some of the geolocations from the region. You could see here, this is one of the videos showing the shellings and the drone drops on Russian forces as they made their way into Kotlyarivka from southern Kyslivka. And so that's just some archives from the battle. But now the Russians have control over these 2 villages. Kyslivka is, especially the eastern portion of it, is located on higher elevation. So is Kotlyarivka. Western Kyslivka is located on a bit of lower elevation. But all the areas that are basically centered around the rail line are on hills that are overlooking the surrounding regions. And those heights extend to Stepove, Novomykhailivka, and also to the village of Ivanivka, which the Russians tried to take over for many, many months last year and failed. And now, not only can they attack directly from Yahidne, but they have the control of Kyslivka from the south. And so now these 2 clusters of villages are in the process of being enveloped, and the Russian forces are looking to get control of them. And in terms of the broader efforts, and the broader, you could say, implications of such an attack and such a overcoming of Ukrainian lines, it would mean that the Russian forces got control of the last villages that Ukrainians are using to defend on the line of contact before the Russians could use the highway to advance westwards and northwestwards to reach the Oskil River line, to reach the Kupiansk outskirts, to reach Petropavlivka, to reach those fortifications that are on the eastern side of Kupiansk. And in the process of that advance, not only would the Russians get control of this massive ridge, because you have a massive ridge in between the current line of contact and the Oskil River line, which the Ukrainians currently control. And that's where they have much of their artillery stationed, their shorter range howitzers, for instance, or mortars. Now all of these areas are going to be under threat if these two villages fall, and they will be used to the Russians' advantage if they're able to succeed in advancing westwards and target the Oskil River line that I guess we can mark in blue over here. And so it really will be critical for the Ukrainians to hold the line, prevent any sort of breakthroughs as the Russians try to now push further northwards. And so you're looking at some of the units in the region, Kraken, territorial defense units, some newly formed mechanized units. It will be interesting to see how it unfolds. And that's really it for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.